The border between Valoria and Dravenmoor was a jagged scar of scorched earth that never truly healed. Princess Elena stood on the stone balcony, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the sky bled into a bruised purple. A plume of black smoke climbed steadily from the valley, thick and oily, choking the afternoon light. It was the third time this month. She watched the embers drift like dead leaves over the fields. Behind her, the heavy thud of boots announced the king. Richard stepped onto the stone, his presence filling the space. He pointed a gloved finger toward the rising column of ash. "The Dravenmoor dogs are burning the grain stores again," he said. Her knuckles whitened, gripping stone. She stared into the black smoke, watching the kingdom's lifeblood dissipate into the wind, waiting for the sun to set. Midnight brought a cold, biting wind. Elena waited until the castle guards rotated before slipping through the servant entrance, her movements practiced and silent. She crossed the outer courtyard, keeping to the deep shadows cast by the stone walls. Beyond the perimeter, the forbidden forest loomed. She pushed through the dense undergrowth, the branches clawing at her path like skeletal fingers. Every snap of a twig sounded like a thunderclap. She navigated by the faint moonlight filtering through the canopy until the trees finally parted. The air in the clearing was stagnant, smelling of damp earth. A man stood near the stream, his hand resting firmly on the hilt of a heavy broadsword. It was Adrian. He stood perfectly still. Elena stopped 10 paces away. The distance between them charged. She reached into her hidden pocket and pulled out a leather-bound map. She stepped forward and laid it on a flat, moss-covered rock. Adrian shifted, his boots crunching on the dry leaves as he moved into the light. Elena met his gaze, her voice steady. "This war is a cycle of starvation," she said, "not glory." The silence that followed was heavy. The clearing became their sanctuary. Every Tuesday, when the moon hung low and the forest grew still, they returned to the mossy bank of the stream. The initial hostility faded, replaced by the quiet, heavy rhythm of two people exhausted by the same war. They sat on the damp earth, the map spread between them, no longer a weapon of statecraft but a blueprint for survival. They shared loaves of bread, breaking the crust with calloused hands. Adrian spoke first, his voice low against the rushing water. He admitted that he had spent his entire life mastering the art of the kill, yet beneath the steel, he felt like nothing more than a hollow shell. Elena listened, her own fatigue mirroring his. They stopped debating borders and started tracing supply lines, calculating how to move grain. The forest floor grew marked with their footprints, a testament to the weeks of whispered logistics. They were no longer heirs of opposing thrones. As the weeks turned into months, the map became worn at the edges. They sat in the silence, bound by the hope that the cycle of starvation could be broken. The Tuesday meeting began with the usual caution, but the air felt brittle. Elena and Adrian sat closer than before, the map forgotten on the moss. Their conversation drifted away from logistics, settling into the rare, dangerous comfort of being understood. Adrian reached across the small gap, his fingers brushing against hers. The contact was brief, a simple grounding touch, but it held the weight of a confession. Neither pulled away. They remained still, listening to the forest, unaware that the silence had been broken. 20 yards away, the thicket shifted. Commander Lucas crouched behind a dense cluster of brambles, his eyes fixed on the clearing. He held his breath, his hand gripping the hilt of his blade. He watched the princess lean toward the prince, their heads bowed together in a shared, private space. Lucas narrowed his gaze, memorizing the angle of their hands. He waited until the two figures stood to part ways. Then he retreated into the shadows, his boots making no sound on the damp soil. The secret was no longer theirs alone. The fragile peace they had built in the dark was already unraveling, and the path back to the castle was now a trail of evidence that would lead to their ruin. The morning sun offered no warmth. King Richard stormed into the private chambers before the dew had dried, his face a mask of rigid fury. He did not speak. He reached into his belt and threw the map onto the stone floor. It skidded, coming to rest at Elena's feet. He grabbed her arm, his grip bruising, and dragged her through the corridors toward the high tower. She did not resist. She watched the heavy iron door swing shut, the lock clicking with finality. The silence in the tower was absolute. Across the border, the atmosphere was equally suffocating. King Alaric stood in the center of his war room, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He summoned Adrian with a sharp gesture. Without a word, he tossed a heavy iron helmet across the table. It struck the wood with a dull, ringing thud. Alaric pointed toward the border, his voice cold and devoid of mercy. He commanded his son to lead the vanguard at dawn. The gears of war had begun to turn, grinding everything in their path. Thousands of soldiers sharpened their blades in the gray light. The sun did not rise. It was smothered. By dawn, the sky had turned a bruised, sickly gray, heavy with the weight of falling ash. It drifted down like snow, coating the grass in the steel of 10,000 blades. The air tasted of burnt wood and cold iron. On the plains, the two armies stood in rigid, silent formation. The silence was not peaceful. It was a physical weight, pressing against the chests of every man on the field. Horses stamped their hooves, snorting in the thick, hazy air, their breath coming in short, ragged plumes. Adrian sat atop his mount at the very front of the vanguard. He gripped the reins, his knuckles white, feeling the animal beneath him tremble with the same nervous energy that rippled through the ranks. He looked toward the horizon, but the ash obscured everything. There was no wind to clear the haze. Every soldier stood frozen, waiting for the command that would turn this stillness into a slaughter. The pressure was absolute. Adrian shifted his weight, his armor clinking softly in the dead air. He stared into the gray void ahead. A sudden movement fractured the stillness of the tree line. Elena burst from the shadows, her breath coming in ragged gasps. As she sprinted across the churned earth, she did not look back at the tower or the forest. She ran toward the center of the field, her boots pounding against the dry, ash-covered soil. The Valorian cavalry was already shifting, the horses beginning to lunge forward as the command to charge rippled through the ranks. The ground began to tremble, a low, rhythmic thrum that vibrated through her soles. She did not slow down. She reached the narrow gap between the front lines, her lungs burning, and threw herself into the dirt. She knelt firmly, head held high, blocking the path of the lead riders. The effect was instantaneous. The lead horse reared, its front hooves clawing at the air, forcing the rider to haul back on the reins. The momentum of the entire line collapsed. Men shouted in confusion, pulling their mounts to a screeching, sliding halt. Dust and ash billowed into the air, obscuring the view. Adrian saw her. She was a small, singular point of defiance against the wall of iron he led. He did not stop to think. He reached for the hilt of his broadsword, pulled it from the scabbard, and let it fall. It landed in the mud with a heavy, dull thud, the blade sinking deep into the muck. He raised his empty hands, palms open, toward the line of archers behind him. From the rear, King Alaric roared, his voice a jagged tear in the heavy air, demanding the charge continue. Adrian did not look back. He kept his eyes locked on the space where Elena knelt. The command to fire died in the throats of the archers. They hesitated, their fingers trembling on the bowstrings. The silence began at the front, a ripple of confusion that traveled backward through the ranks like a wave. Men lowered their spears. Adrian stepped down from his horse. His boots crunched against the dry, uneven ground as he walked toward the center of the field. Every eye in the valley followed his movement. He did not look at his father. He did not look at the spears still pointed in his direction. He kept his gaze fixed on Elena. She remained on her knees, her posture steady, her eyes reflecting the gray sky. He reached the space where she knelt and extended his hand. Elena looked up, her fingers brushing against his palm before she gripped it firmly. She stood up, the movement slow and deliberate. At that exact moment, the thick blanket of ash and smoke above the valley began to thin. A single beam of sunlight pierced the haze, striking the ground between them. It spread outward, turning the gray dust into a shimmering gold. The soldiers watched the light move. The tension that had held the ranks in a rigid, violent posture began to dissipate. One by one, the men at the front dropped their shields. The sound of metal hitting the earth echoed across the clearing, a rhythmic, final percussion. King Alaric shouted again from the rear, but his voice was swallowed by the sudden, profound quiet of the valley. No one moved to obey him. The war had ceased to exist. It had been dismantled not by strategy or steel, but by the simple, radical act of standing still. The era of the sword had passed, leaving behind a field of soldiers who had forgotten why they were told to kill. The sun climbed higher, warming the cold, scarred earth.